Hi, everyone. Welcome to our third and final end of year workshop for BFA CD thesis. We are going to be looking at ways that you can sort of consider presenting your work online and best practices that would support how you form your thesis presentations. In the arc of this presentation, we'll look at a couple of key objectives. We'll look closely at a few examples of strong versus weak presentations, ways that we can consider our environment, how we might use our voice and tone to convey our ideas, but also kind of consider how voice takes form within the presentation, audience visibility, keeping track of time, presentation slides, technical difficulties, preparing for questions, and final presentation submission. So to start, we've pulled a couple of key examples of strong versus weak presentations. And again, some of them are kind of funny and humorous in a way, and really sort of think through the circumstances that we're in right now. But perhaps if we can reduce them, if it's possible. In this context, we see the BBC, a news director sort of having his kids come into the frame, or if we're looking at another case study example, this was really just a humorous moment where we just need to be aware of the camera and how it's always on unless we turn it off. And in this context, we see pajama bottoms. So perhaps not having that be visible for us as we're presenting our thesis presentations, it can be humorous and funny, but also embarrassing on the other end. On your own time, you can kind of look closely at that presentation, or if this is just basically a Zoom call, the link is provided. A couple of other key, really strong presentations are one from Wael Morkos, who presented at Type Drives Culture Conference last year, 2019. And what's really strong about his work is the way in which he's able to captivate the audience, but also use the full screen to present his work. And so do take a full sort of look at his presentation and the way that he begins to talk about his thought process throughout the work that he's showing. And the fourth example we have is just a presentation by Paula Scher. And again, I think what's really notable here is how she's beginning to use her slides to represent the work that she's featuring. And whether it's an open book or the front cover, we kind of see how she uses the imagery of her work as a prop as she's describing her narrative. So in short, with strong presentations, you'll find that the presenters often connect with the audience, that they often keep people engaged. The narrative is generally compelling and easy to follow. There are images on the slides, as I had mentioned before, that are used as props to support verbal narrative. And so it's really important to think about that you are the guide verbally in your presentations, and that the images that you use really complement you talking. So think about that as you're preparing your presentations over the next few weeks. With regard to weak presentations, often presenters tend to ramble or stumble over their words. That becomes difficult for an audience to follow. Reading directly from your slides can also be really distracting and difficult to keep captivating. Presenters that are either too brief or long-winded also are problematic. So again, it's finding the right balance between how much you're showing and how much you're saying, so that it's actually clear, but also easy to sort of see what your work is and how you're describing it. There's also considerations for your background, and in another slide, we'll take a closer look at some things that impact that. But having a messy or a busy background can actually be really distracting, just as much as you might hear loud sounds or see other kind of distractions moving behind you. So if it's possible to reduce as much as the sort of distractions, both in sound and in movement, it will just help people be focused on what you're saying during your presentation. So as we look at some examples of things that are related to environment, again, really, if you can, and again, I know that we're all in sort of various situations, the more that you can sort of be in a quiet space with no distractions, at least for the 20 minutes that you have your presentation, really see if it's possible to find a location wherever you are to really be in a really sort of quiet space. I would also try to keep your background clear. And so what that could be is that, we're not focused on other things that are happening behind you, like all the papers on the floor or your messy bed or all of the things that are sort of like dangling perhaps behind your head. You really want to try to minimize how much is happening in the background. So keeping it clear just makes it helps the audience be more focused on what you're doing and what you're saying. I would also consider, if you are unable to sort of reduce that background, consider the use of a virtual background. It will help obscure the surroundings behind you. And again, there's really some fun ways that you can approach that. Perhaps you might want to use Tiger King. If not, if this is not your jam, there are other ways to use virtual backgrounds, either by blurring out the background or going into settings and into the virtual backgrounds sub menu and really choosing one that perhaps is available to you, or uploading image or video of your choosing. The other really key sort of components that, again, some of you may have already come across, but I'm including here because I think it's really helpful, is using and looking at some of the Zoom video tutorials. I think that there's all different types of content areas that you can explore, but if you're really thinking about just getting more information on virtual backgrounds, there's this particular tutorial that's really helpful in that. And there's also another really great tutorial that I recommend looking at if you're considering working with multiple screens. This one is similarly through Zoom, and the YouTube link is here listed at the top. But if you're considering a way to sort of extend your screen space, sometimes it's helpful when you're trying to prepare your notes or wanting to be able to see your audience. Having a second screen or a second device is actually helpful in that case. So what I would recommend is really still thinking about, if you are using a second screen, that you're not looking off to the left where that second screen is, because again, you're not looking at the camera, which is where the audience is actually watching you. So I've seen that happen too, and that can be a little disorienting. So just kind of be mindful, if you are using a second screen, how you might sort of work with still being visible and directed to the camera. With regard to lighting, the one of the most important pieces is making sure that you have enough light that's visible around your face, so that we, as the audience or anyone who's listening to you present, has the capacity to see you clearly. I think that checking that you are lit from the front, in the front of your face, and not from the back, as in this example here on the left, will help make sure that you are the most visible in the screen. Making note of the lighting in your room ahead of time is helpful, because then you can sort of plan and prepare to perhaps have a particular lighting source that can sort of shine on your face, or be near a lamp or near a light that will not be too distracting while you're on your call. There are opportunities to really shift the way that the light source hits you, such that you really aren't obscured. And so be mindful of camera angles, things being too high, where you're positioning your camera, and really looking directly into that camera lens, so it feels as though you're sitting directly across the table from your audience. And this is just another image example of the light source coming from the window that's just behind the camera. And then there's really considerations for voice and tone. And voice and tone are a really integral part of your presentation. Really being able to project your voice clearly into the mic, whether that's through your open computer or if you have headphones on that have a mic, really making sure that you have a projection into that microphone such that it's clear, it's not muffled, we can hear you. It's important that you're mindful of these things when you're presenting online, because sometimes at the very beginning of the call, if we can't hear you or you sound muffled or things are cutting out, it's really helpful to just be mindful of how clear your voice is in those instances. And generally, when you're presenting online, the fact that we're sort of through this interface can have the tendency to make the translation of your enthusiasm feel reduced, right? So try to be 20% more enthusiastic than you normally would, so that it appears as though you're very engaged within your presentation. And that just might be through the pace or the speed at which you're talking. It could be the pitch, whether it's high or low. It could also be through the volume, whether you're talking very softly or loudly. And then avoid the use of distracting filler words. Like I just said, right? And so I think if we can try our best to reduce saying or or instead of doing and saying those words, really try to see if you can fill that space with silence. And it's a practice that I continue to try to sort of work on myself. So I imagine for all of you as well, it's definitely a struggle, but be mindful of those filler words, because if we lean on them too much, it makes the presentation feel really problematic and uncomfortable to follow. And then there's really considering audience visibility. I think that when we're doing presentations online, the way in which we're able to see our presentation, but also to see the audience simultaneously, is extremely critical, because sometimes it can feel like you're presenting to a vacuum. It feels like you're not really necessarily seeing everyone. So if you don't have the visibility of the entire audience, I would make sure that as you're presenting, you set your settings such that you can see the audience at the same time. And as I mentioned before about having a second screen, sometimes this is helpful when you're wanting to extend your space such that you have that second screen area, so that you can sort of watch the presentation, but also you can watch the mannerisms and facial expressions of your audience and respond accordingly. Because what's really important too within online presentations is the fact that you may encounter internet connection that is, or the Wi-Fi might disconnect. So you want to kind of look out for people following along, making sure they understand what you're saying, and can really see and hear you and sort of follow with the cues that you see from your audience on the other side. And so this is just, again, a screenshot of us if we're working within Zoom, that there's the capacity to begin to see the audience members that overlay on top of the presentation that we might be in. And as we move to keeping track of time, I find that this is also another critical piece to presentation. I think that with presentations, being able to pay attention specifically to the amount of time that you have is essential, right? If you know that you have 10 minutes to present, and perhaps of that 10 minutes, 1 minute is dedicated to you setting up your slides and getting everything ready, you're getting admitted into the Zoom room, you really sort of want to maximize on that last 9 minutes of your presentation. And if you need to work with a stopwatch or a clock, perhaps that's one way to keep focused so that you don't run out of time. I think often I've seen rush presentations at the end, which are always unfortunate because you know that the presenter didn't get through all that they wanted to say, and or it also makes it uncomfortable for the person that has to tell that presenter to stop. So again, if someone tells you that you need to wrap up, make sure you conclude in whatever time that is left or that they've told you that you need to wrap up in. Do not ignore those requests, because again, there's presentations that are going to be before and after you. And you also want to make sure that you get enough feedback from the critics. So be respectful of your audience's time and be respectful of your classmates, just to ensure that everyone gets enough space and time to present and to receive the feedback based on what they are showing for their work. So when it's time's up, time's is up. In relation to your presentation slides, it's really important to think through how you're setting up those slides. And for us as designers, I think that we are within a great capacity to shape our presentations with as much expertise as we can, because we work with type and image. It's part of our core sort of fundamentals as designers. And so if we can avoid templates, while they're super handy, yes, I think that as designers, we have the capacity to design great works that respond to anything that we produce and is actually more responsive to the type of work that you want to have represented as a reflection of your projects and your thesis work. So consider really taking control and shaping how you want your work to be represented, even within a slide form. And so what we've done is select a few key examples of previous thesis student work that begin to look at the kind of anatomy of the slide presentation, right? And so here we see an example from Eric Lish. And what's important to note about this work is that there is an editorial publication that's being featured on this slide, but we see the whole thing. We're not splicing in 20 images. We see one hero image that really gives us a detailed shot of the exterior of the spread. What's nice as he sets it up for us is that we also get additional spread views. So that might be something to consider as you are experimenting with showing perhaps editorial work or print-based work, to have a large hero image that features that work as well. And so the other thing that would be important to note is if you have smaller details that, like on this page, are harder to see at one size, perhaps consider expanding them and increasing them in scale so that they are even more magnified within the slide view. So again, this white bounding box is really to denote the slide itself and the capacity for you to kind of focus in our attention as the audience to certain key areas of your work. In a second example by Benzion Goldman, again, another former student, we see an approach with really simple amounts of text, right? Really short, condensed questions that he was thinking about as a way to demonstrate some of his thinking around his process or his research question. So consider how you might be able to show a small bit of text that guides us through some of your thought process, but perhaps is followed up by an image, a hero image that allows us to see more detail. And as we switch from Benzion for a second to Eileen Liu, we see kind of a similar sort of approach where, again, there's a sidebar, a bit of information, a little bit longer than the previous example. But again, to the right, we see a magnified sort of zoom in of the computation and the work that was being produced by Eileen for this project. And so really the variation that you can have in terms of text to perhaps a key example to perhaps showing larger context around maybe multiple projects or multiple spreads, you want to think about what they each do within the context of the presentation. Perhaps you don't want to show hundreds of images that kind of operate in this context on every single slide, but perhaps you might do it for 2 or 3 slides such that you're able to see an example of how this work lives in context. And the other really great piece that I always like to include, similar to what Eileen is doing here, is a thank you note, or not even really a note, but a thank you sort of sign off that ends the presentation. It's helpful because it allows the audience to know that you've come to an end point, that you are concluding, and that they sort of can see you get to a point that closes the chapter on what your presentation was about. So consider a thank you or some kind of endpoint at the last slide, such that it allows us, like I said, to really feel like we've come to the end of your presentation. And to go back to Bencion's one more time, we have other opportunities within our presentations to show things that we are referencing or have been inspired by, or context in which you see your work living, or communities or cultures that sort of are connected to it. So in this case, again, it may not be necessarily your work per se, but it might be things that you're inspired by, or guided your sort of thinking process as you approach this work for your thesis projects. And oops, it looks like this is just a duplicate. So again, just as a recap here, keep your visuals simple, be selective about what you show, try to maximize your width on the screen to use widescreen proportions, so 16:9. Some best practices to keep the slide clean would include one slide. You could have one image, GIF, or video. On another slide, you could potentially have one main elaboration. On another slide, you could have less than 100 words. And then you also can add new slide transitions for every new concept. So I'm not saying your thesis presentation needs to be 4 slides, but you can alternate how you treat your slides so that there's a pacing and a rhythm that's really comfortable for an audience to follow, but also such that they become a backdrop to you sort of explaining how your work lives and how it evolved over the course of the year. And the last point is just, again, finding the right balance between a video, an image, a GIF, an illustration, like photography. What is that? How does that look? Be sort of mindful of a pacing that's easy to follow, and not to the degree that it's hard to sort of know where you're going next, unless that's your intent and it sort of fits the sort of scope of your work. And then there's also technical difficulties, because this is inevitable. We're presenting in a space that has the potential to turn off on us in any moment, that can disrupt, be disconnected. It's a pain when this happens, but we need to anticipate it occurring and not breaking down, freaking out to a degree where you're not able to be focused or feel like you're not able to get back on track. We want to avoid that happening. Again, we anticipate that there could potentially be Wi-Fi disruptions, but it's how you sort of make do within sort of your preparation for your presentation that sort of helps push away from that disruption in a way that you can solve it and be okay. And we really want you to consider this checklist of ways that can set you up to anticipate anything that might go wrong, or at least begin a Zoom call with some awareness on the different settings that you have. So the first piece would be, again, as I had mentioned earlier, finding a quiet or suitable environment to begin to do your call. Perhaps muting computer notifications. I've seen hundreds of notifications come on student screens. It's often weird and bizarre when messages are popping up and I'm probably not supposed to see them. So to avoid that happening with me or your critic, you want to perhaps consider muting computer notifications if your screen does get shared. Open Zoom, click on the call link. Also consider checking your internet and phone connection, just as much as you're also checking your audio and your camera settings. And if it's necessary, to use your headphones such that you're able to hear clearly what your audience is saying, but also such that the mic, if it's a headphone with mic, they can actually hear you clearly as you're projecting into the microphone. As I mentioned previously, check your lighting and the environment that you're around such that you're visible within the camera. If you notice it's dark, try to see if you can sort of reposition so that that can sort of be adjusted on the fly. And have your presentation links or other materials that you need ready so that, again, you're able to not go find things at the beginning of your presentation, but that you know that it's ready to go and you can hit share screen and really be in presentation mode just at the start of your time slot for your thesis presentation. And the last 2 points, again, just double checking that you can share your screen within the Zoom call, and overall just paying attention to when glitches happen, when you can or you cannot hear what people are saying or they can't hear you. So anticipate that that might happen. And the other piece that I didn't have listed here, but really is helpful, I would say, is consider having Zoom on your phone as an app. It can also provide a backup in case your Wi-Fi stops working. Perhaps you can use your cellular data and log into the Zoom link there. But having perhaps that as a backup in case something goes wrong is just always helpful, I find. And the last couple of screenshots within this section sort of just go over the settings that you can adjust in Zoom. And again, settings for audio or video or the virtual background, as we talked about earlier, are helpful because you can sort of make changes to the space that's within here. And then just to go back to notifications, if you have a Mac computer, to consider going into system preferences or the equivalent on a PC, but really turn those notifications off so that they don't disrupt during the time that you have your presentation. And as we begin to prepare for questions that we might receive, you should really think through questions that critics or your classmates or peers might ask about your thesis work, right? I think that it's common to have work be critiqued, and it's also common for that critique to happen at the conclusion of a presentation. So how do you respond, right? What do you say? What's your sort of rationale behind your thinking on your work? It's really important to not just say, hey, this is all the cool projects that I did, but more that you're sort of considering what the thinking was, because you will be asked questions that are within that space. And it's always helpful to sort of mentally prepare what you might say and anticipate that so that your rationale or your design thinking is actually pretty much sort of close at hand, even if you don't necessarily know which questions might get asked. So the last few slides here pertain specifically to the final presentation submission. So every thesis student will need to submit their thesis presentation for final submission. And so what does that thesis presentation include? One, we're saying that you should include at least one project from the first semester and at least one project from the second semester of thesis. And we recognize that many of you have multiple projects. So it's more about thinking about the key projects that have evolved that are of most consequence to where your thesis has gone, and including sort of that process from start to finish. The other key questions I would think about are, what was your research question? How did you arrive at your ideas, as I've mentioned before? Where does your work live in relation to graphic design or communication design? And what's its context, right? These are critical questions that you want to sort of think through beyond, again, just showing the work in a sort of advertiserial sort of format. So really think about how you can sort of represent your thinking, your research questions, the context or the precedents that support your thesis work. As a reminder, Final presentations are Friday, May 1st from 9 a.m. to 2:40. You'll have 10 minutes to present, and you'll have 10 minutes for feedback from critics. So about 20 minutes total. But again, be mindful of at least a minute or two to get yourself into the Zoom link and to test out any sort of screen sharing functionality at the very beginning so that you're prepped and ready to go. So all of that needs to happen within the 20 minutes. And you just want to make sure that you are comfortable and ready to go just within your time slot. Your thesis faculty will act as hosts in each Zoom room. They will admit you into the Zoom room before the start of each session. So it will be key to, again, be in the waiting room and wait till you're admitted into that space. But you will be notified of your time slots ahead of time. So that will be forthcoming in the next few weeks. The other last point that's important to note here is that one of your peers from your class will take notes when the critic provides feedback. So in that Zoom room, there will be at least 3 to 4 critics and yourself and one other student that will be able to take notes while the critics are giving feedback. And in terms of collection, please upload your presentation to this Google Drive folder. And again, when you have access to the links within this presentation, you'll be able to click through into the folder itself from this slide deck. But we do need to receive those by Thursday, April 30th at 5 p.m. And this is the day before final presentations. For keynote presentations, please upload a packaged file in order to ensure correct display of embedded fonts. For Google Slides, make sure the presentations are freely accessible and do not require a sign-in link. And for PDFs, just make sure that you're sort of accounting for the aspect ratio for widescreen. And really, it's PDFs, it's Keynote, it's also Google Slides, but thinking that, again, to maximize on the full width of the 16:9 ratio, adjust your presentations accordingly, because again, it really sort of be a nice full screen experience for the audience as they're viewing your slides. And the last slide that I have is really the exercise for this week, is to present a few slides from your thesis work to a few classmates or friends via Zoom and work within a presentation format for that. Try to screen record your presentation and watch the playback. And in that playback, consider the following. What is the quality of your voice? How fast or slow are you talking? Are your ideas coming across clearly? And are you able to see the audience while you're in screen share mode, right? So these questions are really meant to think about your speed, your pacing, how quickly you're thinking about or sharing your ideas, and really your comfortability with being in a presentation mode, such that you're able to see the work and you're able to see your audience at the same time. And so with that, this is our, like I said, final workshop for the year. So thank you again for reviewing these slides. And again, you'll see a link so you can access them further.